into a bank to deposit $5 million, and the staff laughed in his face, called him a fraud, and shoved him toward the door. What they didn't know was that he wasn't just a customer, he was the hidden shareholder of the very bank they worked for. Minutes later, their arrogance turned into panic, their jobs into ashes, and the truth came crashing down harder than anyone imagined. This story is full of twists you won't see coming, and the lesson at the end is worth every second. Stay with us until the very last moment. You don't want to miss it. He walked into the bank carrying $5 million, and not a single person in that lobby believed him. Todd was 68, his silver hair combed neatly back, his jacket faded at the elbows, his shoes softened from years of wear. To the world inside that branch, he looked like nothing more than another weary old man. No polished suit, no entourage, no aura of wealth. Just a quiet figure moving toward the counter, envelope in hand. But inside that envelope was the kind of money that could reshape lives. And inside Todd himself lived a truth that would make every smirk in that room curdle into regret. He was not only wealthy, he was a hidden shareholder of the very bank that now prepared to laugh him out the door. "I'd like to make a deposit," he said, placing the envelope gently on the counter. $5 million. For a second, silence. Then came the chuckle from the teller, a young man with a tie too bright and a smile too sharp. "Sir, maybe you meant 500, or 5,000 at most." His voice carried across the marble lobby, drawing glances, drawing laughter. 5 million? In cash? In that jacket? The manager appeared, her heels clicking like a metronome of authority. She looked Todd up and down, the way one studies a stranger who has wandered into the wrong room. "Sir, let's be serious," she said. "This line is for customers with actual business. Why don't you return another day when you gathered the proper amount?" The words dripped with disdain. Todd did not flinch. His hands rested steady on the counter. "This is the day," he answered, but his calm only fueled their contempt. The teller leaned closer, lowering his voice but not his mockery. "Look, old man, we don't have time for jokes. You've got a few hundred at most, maybe a pension check, but 5 million? Not today." The lobby began to shift, customers whispering, some amused, some uncomfortable, no one intervening. Todd stood alone beneath their eyes, his dignity stripped not by evidence but by assumption. The final insult came when the manager waved her hand toward the door. "Please leave before we escalate. We can't waste resources on this." And so the man who held in his hands the kind of stake that could decide their futures, the man whose quiet power reached into their paychecks and beyond, was shown the exit like a fraud. He stepped outside, the city air colder than the lobby's indifference, and he let the door close behind him. But the story did not end there. The next morning, the branch was summoned for an emergency meeting. Overnight, a customer's phone recording had circulated online, showing employees sneering at an elderly man claiming to deposit millions. "Racism at Apex Bank," the caption read. "Humiliating the elderly." Calls had flooded headquarters. Complaints multiplied. The story had gone viral before the staff had even brewed their morning coffee. The manager stood at the head of the table, face pale, trying to spin the narrative. "We were following protocol," she insisted. "He had no proof, no suit." Her voice stopped cold when the director walked in, phone pressed to his ear, face grave. He ended the call, looked at them, and said a single sentence that froze every soul in the room. That man was Todd. Confusion first, then dawning horror. "Todd?" someone whispered. "The shareholder?" "Yes," the director said flatly. "The man you mocked, the one you shoved toward the door, is one of the largest private stakeholders in this bank. He owns the floor beneath your feet, and yesterday you humiliated him." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every laugh from the day before now hung in the air like a noose. That afternoon, Todd called directly. His voice was calm, but his words cut sharper than any blade. "This is not about me," he told the director. "This is about what your staff has chosen to become. If this is how you treat a man who owns a piece of your institution, how do you treat those with no power? How many voices have you silenced because they lack the leverage to fight back?" Within hours, the verdict was clear. The manager and the teller were terminated. Access revoked, titles stripped, badges deactivated. In their place, new policies were announced: mandatory training on bias, stricter oversight, zero tolerance for humiliation disguised as protocol. The bank would not bury this scandal. It would bleed it out into reform. Todd never raised his voice. He never demanded respect for himself. Instead, he demanded justice for everyone who had walked into that lobby, past or future, and been judged by clothing, by age, by appearance, rather than truth. The story spread across headlines, but what lingered was not the firing, not even the viral outrage. It was the image of a quiet old man, underestimated, dismissed, standing calmly in the storm of contempt, then revealing himself as the storm's master. And beneath it all lay a question meant for every onlooker, every reader, every witness. How many Todds have we pushed aside, not knowing the power, the humanity, the history they carry? How many times have we chosen arrogance over empathy, and in doing so written our own downfall? The employees learned too late. The world perhaps still has time. Todd carried the kind of silence that unsettles a room. At 68, he moved slowly, but with a gravity that could not be mistaken for weakness. His silver hair framed a face marked not by defeat but by time creases carved by battles fought in boardrooms and streets, by victories no one in that bank would have credited to him. His eyes, sharp and steady, seemed to look not at the teller line but through it, as if measuring something deeper, something invisible to those who stood behind the glass counters. Most saw only the surface, the worn jacket, the softened shoes, the cane he leaned on when the tremor in his leg betrayed him. They saw an old man, alone, and assumed fragility. What they did not see was the ledger of his life, written in numbers that stretched into millions, in shares and assets that kept their very doors open. They did not see that Todd was a hidden shareholder of the bank they served, a man whose influence could rattle every certificate hanging on the walls around them. But Todd never carried himself as a man of power. He carried himself as someone who had learned the futility of appearances. He had once worn the tailored suits, the gold cufflinks, the trappings of status. They had not shielded him from prejudice then, and they would not have shielded him now. So he abandoned them, favoring honesty over disguise, substance over theater. He dressed as himself, an old man in ordinary clothes, as if to test the world one more time to see if it had learned to value dignity over display. There was a reason he chose this day, this branch, this act. Rumors had reached him in quiet currents, stories whispered of bias in the very institution he had helped to build. Customers turned away for being too different, too poor, too brown, too old. Complaints buried in drawers, ignored until they withered into silence. Todd had spent his life investing in numbers, but numbers meant nothing if people were discarded at the door. He wanted to see the truth himself, not through reports or polished presentations, but through the raw eyes of those who wielded daily power at the counter. The envelope he carried was heavy with more than paper. It held $5 million, yes, but also a test, a mirror he would place in front of the institution. Would they see a man, or would they see only a costume? Would they weigh the content of his request, or only the texture of his coat? Every step toward the counter was measured, deliberate, as though each was a countdown to revelation. The lobby buzzed with the life of ordinary business. He could hear the clicking of keyboards, the muted conversations, the shuffle of feet. Yet as he moved, the air seemed to thicken, not because they knew who he was, but because they thought they knew what he wasn't. Eyes slid over him with impatience. A woman in line sighed loudly, as though his presence alone slowed the world, and when he finally reached the glass partition and placed the envelope down, the tension coiled, ready to snap. "I'd like to make a deposit," he said, his voice even, his gaze unshaking. $5 million. It was not a boast. It was not a dare. It was a statement, plain and unembellished, the way one might ask for change at a store, yet the simplicity of it struck like lightning. Silence fell first, then the laughter, disbelieving, dismissive, cruel in its ease. But Todd did not waver. His eyes stayed steady, his voice calm, his posture unbent, because he knew what they did not. The moment they mocked him, the moment they dismissed him, they were writing their own fate. The man they thought powerless held the keys to their future, and with each sneer they sharpened the blade that would cut them down. Inside him, two truths wrestled: the sting of being belittled and the steel of knowing what was to come. That tension radiated from him, invisible yet palpable, the way a storm charges the air before the first strike of thunder. He had not come for vengeance, but for clarity. And clarity was arriving, mercilessly, in every smirk, every chuckle, every gesture that revealed the rot he had suspected all along. He stood there, still as stone, letting the moment grow, letting their laughter echo, letting their arrogance climb higher. Because he understood something they did not. The higher arrogance rises, the harder it falls. And fall it would. The branch had never been this quiet. Phones rang unanswered, keyboards stilled, conversations frozen as the director's words fell like a hammer. That man you mocked yesterday was Todd. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then a whisper from the far end of the table, raw, disbelieving, fragile. The shareholder, the one on the board. The director's stare was unflinching. The very one who owns more of this institution than every face in this room combined. And yesterday, you laughed him out of his own bank. The manager's knees wobbled, but she pressed her lips into a line, desperate to salvage authority. We followed protocol, she said. He looked suspicious. He offered no. The phone on the table vibrated, its screen alive with a single name. The director pressed speaker. And then came the voice, low and deliberate, carrying 68 years of storms. This is Todd. Chairs creaked as bodies shifted, hearts stuttered, eyes darted. The manager rose instinctively. Mr. Todd, please allow me to explain. His voice sliced her plea clean. You shouldn't have to explain why you laughed at a man you assumed had nothing. The truth is simple. You didn't see a customer. You saw a costume. You saw age. You saw what you wanted to see, and you believed your judgment was law. Silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. The teller who had shoved him swallowed hard, his fingers white against the table's edge. Todd's voice came again, softer, sharper. What you thought was inconvenience was evidence. What you thought was weakness was a mirror, and now that mirror is turned toward you. The director's phone pinged with notifications, but no one dared look. The video of yesterday's humiliation had leapt beyond the city, carried across networks, reposted, dissected. Hashtags multiplied like sparks in dry grass. A bank ejects its own owner. Racism in real time. Age doesn't erase worth. The world was watching, and every eye now bore down on this room. The youngest clerk, barely out of college, found her voice trembling into the silence. There was a list, she whispered, as if confessing in church. Heads whipped toward her. Not written, but spoken. Certain customers, extra screening, extra delays. The manager told us it was to protect the brand. We knew who she meant. Gasps cracked the room open. The manager's face drained, then hardened into steam. Lies, she snapped. You're twisting words. The director leaned forward. Is it true? His question cut like a blade. The teller, pale, sweating, finally lifted his eyes. It's true. We stalled people who didn't fit, people who didn't look safe. I followed orders. But we all knew. The room erupted, voices tangling, denials, half admissions, the raw sound of reputations unraveling. Todd's voice returned, steady as a judge's gavel. Every time you delayed service, every time you doubted someone because of a jacket, a face, a color, you weren't protecting this bank. You were burying it. You thought silence would protect you, but silence has a cost. His words pressed into the marrow of the room, unrelenting. You put your hands on me. You shoved me to the door, but I carry power. What about those who don't? What about the man denied a loan? The woman whose account you froze? The immigrant you stalled until he gave up? They don't sit on your board. They don't own your building. Who protects them? The teller's breath shuddered. The clerk's eyes brimmed. The manager clung to the edge of defiance, but her voice betrayed her, shaking as she spat. You can't just, I can. Todd cut in, calm as a storm's eye. And I will. At that moment, the door burst open. An assistant rushed in, clutching a tablet. It's everywhere, she said, her voice breaking. 9 million views overnight. National news picked it up. They're calling it the day a bank mocked its own owner. Civil rights groups want statements. Investors are calling. The director closed his eyes, his face collapsing into his hands. The staff sat frozen, pale and wordless, like statues awaiting their sentence. Todd's voice filled the silence one final time. You believed yesterday ended when you pushed me out that door. It didn't. Yesterday was only the beginning. And then the line went dead. The manager tried to speak, but nothing came. The teller whispered a prayer to no one. The clerk sat straighter, her confession still echoing. The director finally looked up, his face ashen. By tomorrow, he said, half of you won't work here. And by the week's end, this branch will not look the same. The walls seemed to shrink, the air too tight to breathe. Outside, the lobby filled with customers waiting for service, unaware that the ground beneath them was already crumbling. And somewhere in the city, Todd, the man they had humiliated, was already dialing his next call, to whom no one knew. But they understood this much. Whatever came next, it would not be mercy. The email hit their phones 5 minutes before noon. A summons with no subject line, only a room number. By the time the staff filed in, the blinds were drawn and the coffee tasted like punishment. The director stood without a jacket and said what everyone had been dreading. Effective immediately, access suspended, badges on the table, keys too. The red light on the door reader blinked its small refusal, and the room felt smaller by the breath. Remorse arrived as heat, not thunder. The teller who had steered Todd toward the door could feel it on his skin, a prickle that would not fade. He remembered the white shine on the marble, the weight of his hand on an old man's elbow, the way the lobby had gone quiet when laughter did its work. He built a defense out of policy and risk and a busy day, and the defense collapsed the moment he touched it. Across from him, the youngest clerk sat rigid and wide-eyed, the only voice yesterday that asked anyone to look twice before they judged. HR read the findings in a tone so clean it hurt. 9 written complaints had been buried. 12 incidents were reconstructed from cameras and timestamps. 3 elderly customers never returned after long delays. A woman's check expired in a drawer. The numbers looked small on paper and huge in consequence, because every number had a face. Todd did not enter the room, but his presence weighted the air. The teller wanted to apologize, not to salvage a paycheck, but to set down what had crawled under his ribs. He remembered Todd's eyes, calm in a way that made excuses look cheap. It is easy to resent a shout, he thought. It is hard to face a mirror that does not blink. Termination letters slid across the table. Email went dark. Scheduling went dark. Internal chat went dark. Each blackout closed with a soft click more painful than yelling. The manager asked about severance and appeals in due process. HR answered with clauses and citations and dates. She had spent years using a tone that made other people small. She lifted her chin and it trembled anyway. The clerk who had spoken up was asked to remain. The director told her there would be a place on a compliance team the bank was building by nightfall. Relief and dread collided in her chest. Relief because courage had not been punished. Dread because she knew what courage had cost the customers who never came back. She thought of her grandmother counting tips at a kitchen table and understood that respect is a currency that rarely circulates unless someone pays the fee. In the lobby, the lights felt brighter. Several customers recognized faces from the clip and held their phones like lanterns, not to provoke, but to promise attention. The building sounded different now, less like money and more like breath. He thought of calling his mother. He thought of writing to the people he had delayed. He thought of the man who left with a blank stare last winter and felt his chest pulled tight. At 4, the director gathered the remaining staff and spoke without jargon. "We will not fix this with posters," he said. "We will fix this by refusing to measure legitimacy in fabric and age. Training will happen, and audits will happen, and apologies will happen, but none of it matters if the small daily decisions do not change." He searched their faces for the part that still wanted to do the right thing and had simply fallen asleep. The manager's composure cracked. She said she had wanted order, not harm. She said fear of fraud had warped into fear of people. She said she had grown proud of being the gate, and only now understood that a gate is not a crown. No one applauded. The clerk watched the window where the city moved like a river and wondered how many gates were disguised as promotions. She did not gloat. She felt the thin ache of knowing that justice, when late, Still leaves a bruise. Structural reform, immediate. Listening sessions with the community. A whistleblower line with teeth. A quarterly equity audit written in plain language. A standing committee that included customers from neighborhoods most often ignored. An invitation for Todd to address the branch, not as a ghost of consequence, but as the owner whose signature could become a promise. Dusk lifted along the street. The teller stepped outside and the streetlights flickered away. Regret is not redemption, he thought, but it can be a beginning if it costs you something. He opened his phone and began typing a message he could not rehearse. Inside, the conference room lights came on for a call no one expected, and the night held its breath to hear who would speak first. He stood before them not as a man wronged, but as a mirror they could no longer turn away from. The air in the room was taut, the kind of silence that trembles under its own weight, the kind that swallows excuses whole. Todd was 68, his frame weathered, his voice carved from the granite of decades, and yet he spoke with the measured patience of someone who had nothing left to prove. His words did not arrive like thunder. They descended like a slow, heavy rain that soaks through the skin until there is no escaping it. You thought my value could be measured in fabric and polish, he said, his eyes moving from face to face, lingering on those who had laughed. But wealth does not wear a uniform, and dignity is not issued with a suit. You assumed, and in your assumption, you revealed who you are. What you do to the invisible, you will do to the powerful when you mistake him for the same. The manager's gaze broke first. She dropped her eyes to the table, and in that small collapse was the truth she could not mask. The certainty she had wrapped around herself had been nothing but paper armor. The teller clenched his hand so tightly the blood drained from his knuckles. He had shoved a man who could have ended his career with a gesture, but that was not what haunted him. It was the memory of pushing someone he thought powerless, as if the act itself were harmless because no one would record it, because no one would care. Todd stepped closer, the hush following him like shadow. You humiliated me, but I am not the lesson. The lesson is every customer who walked into this place before me. Every person you decided was too small to be worth your patience, too poor to be worth your respect, too different to be worth your trust. I can recover from being mocked, but can this institution recover from being hollow? The words cracked through the room, and for a moment it felt as if the walls themselves were listening. Todd's hand rested on the envelope he still carried, the $5 million that had been treated like a prop for a joke. He held it not as evidence of power, but as a symbol of how easily value can be dismissed when judgment takes the place of truth. You thought silence protected you, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that forced them to lean in. But silence is an accomplice. Every time you said nothing, every time you looked away, you wove yourself into the harm. And when the harm came to light, so did your complicity. Understand this. Neutrality is not innocence. It is choice disguised as absence. The young clerk who had spoken up swallowed hard. She did not glow with triumph. She looked haunted, as though courage had been nothing more than refusing to suffocate. Her presence in the room was proof that conscience still flickered, but also proof of how rare it had become. Todd let his gaze settle on her, then back to the others. Do you see why you are here now? You thought I was testing you with money. I was testing you with humanity. And you failed, not because you lacked training, but because you lacked reverence for the simplest truth. Every person who steps across that threshold deserves the same respect you give the signature on your paycheck, because without them, that signature vanishes. A long pause followed, weighted and brutal. The manager lifted her face, searching for some path back to dignity. We can learn, she whispered, almost pleading. Todd nodded once, but not gently. Learning is not the point. Changing is. He turned as if to leave, but stopped at the door. His voice, now low but ironclad, sealed the moment. Remember this. It should not take a shareholder to remind you that people are not furniture you arrange to your liking. Respect is not charity. It is the rent you pay for occupying another human being's time. If you cannot give it freely, you do not belong here. And if you cannot understand it, the world outside will teach you, with consequences harsher than mine. The room stayed motionless long after he left, each person trapped in the echo of his words. Regret seeped in, thick and bitter, but regret had no power to alter what had already been seen, what had already been recorded, what had already been judged. They realized, too late, that they had not insulted a man, they had betrayed the very foundation of their profession. And somewhere beyond those walls, the city pulsed with people who had lived the same dismissal, people who now watched and waited to see if this time, at last, the lesson would hold. The staff sat in their silence, knowing that Todd's final gift was not his money, not his authority, but the mirror he left behind. And every time they dared to look into it, they would see not him, but themselves. The story was not his anymore. It was theirs, and they would carry it, whether as a weight that crushed them or as a chance to rise, depended on the choices they made after the silence ended. In the end, the story of Todd is not just about a man with hidden power walking into a bank. It is about the mirror he held up for everyone to see. What happened inside that lobby was not a mistake, not an accident, but a reflection of how quickly we as people decide who belongs and who does not, based on nothing more than appearance. Yesterday, it was Todd, a shareholder and owner, dismissed because he looked ordinary. But the deeper truth is that countless others without titles, without power, have faced the same humiliation with no audience, no justice, no redemption. What makes this story resonate is not the twist of identity, but the reminder that dignity should not depend on wealth, clothing, or age. Respect is not a privilege we hand out sparingly. It is a basic currency of human interaction. When we fail to offer it, we don't just diminish others, we diminish ourselves. Because the measure of a society, of a workplace, of a community, is not how it treats the powerful, but how it treats those it believes are powerless. That is the lesson Todd left behind, and it carries weight beyond the walls of a single branch. It speaks to every institution that buries complaints, every manager who chooses comfort over justice, every bystander who watches and says nothing. It asks us to look harder at the moments we assume are small, because those moments reveal our character more than grand speeches ever will. The question is not what we would do if confronted with a millionaire in disguise, but how we treat the stranger who walks in with nothing to prove except their right to be respected. This is not about punishment or revenge. It is about alignment, about making sure our values and our actions match. It is about understanding that silence in the face of bias is not neutral. It is complicit. And it is about realizing that change does not begin with sweeping policies or press releases, but with the daily choices of people who decide to see others as equals. That is the core of human decency, and without it, no institution, no business, and no person can stand for long. So as you reflect on this story, let it be more than entertainment. Let it be a question you carry. When someone is dismissed, mocked, or doubted for no reason other than how they look, will you stand silent or will you step forward? Each of us will face that test in some form. The answer we give is not about them, it is about us. If this story moved you even a little, I invite you to share it with someone who might need the reminder. Leave a comment with your own thoughts or experiences, because your voice adds to the conversation. And if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge, that inspire, that pull lessons from the quiet corners of life, subscribe to our channel and follow along. We believe the best stories are not just told, they are carried, lived, and passed on. Thank you for watching, and may your day ahead be filled with kindness, courage, and the kind of respect that does not need wealth or titles to be given freely.